Excellent. Well, welcome everyone. We're really pleased that you can be with us today for the next webinar in our series of webinars as part of the Belonging Project. So for those of you who are new to the Belonging Project, I wanted to just give a quick overview. Basically, building on the concept of Ubuntu, we built a collaborative network of professional and personal support for diverse legal talent across legal industry organizations this year as a result of COVID. For those of you who don't know the word Ubuntu, it became popular worldwide during apartheid, as Bishop Desmond Tutu explained a philosophy in multiple South African ethnic groups that humanity derives from the humanity of the collective. Ubuntu symbolizes the universal bond we have as people and the focus on collective responsibility. Just as the pandemic has illustrated how interdependent we are, this collective is focused on working together to move forward in our shared commitment to improving inclusion and diversity in the legal profession. And we believe that we rise and fall together in that goal. So we're really excited that you're here with us as guests today in one of our webinars, like I mentioned. Today we're going to be talking about establishing goals. So first, let's go to the next slide. Sin, can we go to the next slide? Excellent. So we have a legal disclaimer here. Obviously, this is informational purposes only, but I did want to introduce myself. And on the next slide, you'll see the faces of our two co-presenters today. So my name is Laura Mecklin. I'm a partner here at Seyfarth Shaw. I am a member of the People Analytics Group and chair of the National Labor and Employment Department. I'm here with Annette Timon, my partner, who is my practice group leader, who leads the People Analytics Group. Annette, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. We're excited to get together today and share a little bit about goals and how you set benchmarks in various D&I efforts. So pleased to be here with you all.
Excellent. So next slide, we'll just jump right into the topic of the hour. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to first talk a little bit about the legal framework, the business and societal framework as well, and how that all plays together in how we might look at setting goals as part of a DEI program. To the extent that Annette and I start shortening terms during our discussion today, we use a lot the term DEI or D&I. That is referring to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We also talk a lot about the concept of belonging. So the idea of diversity, of course, is recognizing the individual attributes of each person within an organization. So truly everybody brings diversity to an organization. Inclusion means creating a sense of inclusion for each of those people. And then we really love focusing on the concept of belonging, where we are hoping to help organizations, including our own, push forward a sense of belonging for everyone to succeed and thrive within an organization. But just in case we use the term DEI and you're confused about what that might mean, I wanted to make sure to cover that. So after we talk about the legal framework, as well as the other background for this discussion, we're going to then talk on what we call a three-step framework for how to build DEI goals for your DEI strategies. And then we're going to talk a little bit about transparency, accountability, and really focusing there a bit on kind of actual implementation of how we do goals. So next slide, we'll just jump right into the societal, business, and legal framework. So again, next slide. So here, we don't have to, say anything more than just looking at the icons on this slide to most of you. We're really living in a unique environment in 2020, in a business environment as well as a social environment where there are a significant number of social issues that are playing into how we experience our day-to-day world as workers, as leaders, as managers within our own organizations. And in fact, as evidenced by why we are all here together as part of the Belonging Project, some of these factors also, hit the legal industry in ways that can be unique. So, we've been looking a lot as lawyers who focus in the employment context on, people analytics, on diversity issues, on, inclusion issues of our clients, as well as the framework of just basic legal issues we see every day as employment lawyers. And there are a lot of ways in which, the methods and the background for how a strategy is built around a DEI program, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of considerations, and there are certainly a significant level of legal considerations as well. So next slide. So first, we want to just go over, we have a broad array of different people who attend Belonging Project webinars. So we want to just give a little bit of background to really frame up the legal baseline for the issues we might talk about today. So there are a variety of federal statutes, of course, that apply to the equal opportunity, what we call the EEO context within employment. The primary statute we talk about a lot is Title VII. That is a federal statute that covers workers based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And it basically says that employers cannot discriminate with regard to any term, condition, or privilege of employment in certain aspects of their process or decisions, so that it applies to recruiting, hiring, and advancement within an employer. It also talks about compensation or other terms, condition, and privileges. So we also have these other federal statutes that we've listed here today that protect on other bases. So, for example, the ADEA protects individuals 40 years of age or older. We have the ADA that protects qualified individuals with disabilities. And then, of course, there are a whole panoply of state statutes that also protect based on discrimination, and sometimes in much broader ways than the federal statutes. So I sit in California. We have many other bases of protected status categories in California. So it's always helpful to understand, as an employer or as a lawyer practicing in this area, the applicable statutes that may apply. So the next slide, please. So when you're looking at diversity and inclusion and equity programs, and when you're looking at how to build a good strategy for how to drive that program forward, and you're thinking about how to do that within compliance of the law, whether it be federal, regional, or local laws, we like to think about the U.S. law really kind of requiring a balance. So on the one hand, you're balancing the forms of discrimination that can come up, typically come up in the employment context, where you want to avoid any type of program or initiative that considers, based on a protected category, someone's status when making employment decisions. You also want to be careful of any kind of neutral employment practice that may have a disproportionate or negative effect on employees or applicants, which we call disparate impact discrimination. Those are balanced against other proactive DEI efforts that are just fine to do as long as they're lawful, which is, proactive efforts to be able to recruit or employ people, promote them, and really focus on a culture of inclusion and belonging. So at all points in time when we're talking about setting goals or other types of DEI initiatives, we're always looking at that balance. So the next slide. One thing that has come up a lot recently within this context is something that a lot of people call reverse discrimination. This is a phrase that actually it makes me grit my teeth to use the term reverse discrimination, because as this slide explains, basically it refers to discrimination just in the terms, conditions, and privileges of employment, but it refers to that discrimination against members of historically advantaged groups, on the basis of those protected status categories under Title VII, for example. So while this is a commonly used phrase, reverse discrimination, and it might suggest that it's something other than just a regular form of discrimination, the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the agency that enforces Title VII and other federal EEO statutes, has actually taken the position that reverse discrimination and is just plain discrimination. What this means is that members of historically advantaged groups, just as members of historically disadvantaged groups, are equally protected under Title VII. So if somebody is singled out and a decision is made based on their race, even if they are a Caucasian male under the age of 40 and they are not LGBT, then and so they are understood in a particular organization to be a majority not historically disadvantaged group, they are still protected from discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, or religion. So it's important to know that the EEO statutes generally are neutral in their application, meaning they protect everyone based on these status categories, and not just some people based on the fact that they maybe have been historically disadvantaged in our society. So next slide. Here we cite a very famous case, Grutter, for the fact that courts have really recognized that the benefits of diversity programs can be very real, and that American businesses have made very clear in a lot of different ways that diversity is important for not just the global marketplace, but also for individual organizations. So when we're looking at the balancing, we never want to lose track of the purpose behind DEI programs and the real business advantage, as well as the advantages you get with your talent within organizations by pushing forward DEI programs. The point here, of course, we don't want to be the no people as employment lawyers. We don't want to, quash, these very important efforts, but we just want to make sure we fit them into a legal framework that ensures that they are compliant under the law. So the next slide, please. We also then cite to the EEOC compliance manual. So here the EEOC has also recognized that people subject to Title VII should be allowed to modify their employment systems and practices under the statutes, but also to push forward diversity programs in a way that is lawful. So they are basically, again, recognizing essentially this balancing concept where we want to make sure to stay within the law, but still push forward on affirmative action and diversity programs. So the next slide. So how do we frame this up? And let's move it to how are we actually creating goals? And when do we start looking at diversity strategy and what might that look like? So a lot of times, we've done this, ourselves as an organization, and we also look to help clients do this. But it's very important to first look in building a diversity strategy and asking the question, what is the problem that we're actually trying to solve? We see a lot of clients now, especially in light of the societal and political framework, really having a strong desire to push forward with some type of diversity strategy, and they think part of that should be definitely building goals. Like we should build goals to work against some type of data for making progress in the area of diversity and inclusion. But it's really important to back up for a minute and really, as an organization, have a conversation about what is the problem we're actually trying to solve, because that is actually very different depending on what organization you sit in. So the questions could be, are we dealing with, an application issue? Do we not have the right number of candidates applying in the right types of categories? Do we have more of an issue of candidates, not being interviewed or selected, or maybe they're selected and then something happens after that? So I think it's important to engage in some analysis as an organization to figure out, what might the issues be to building a robust, diverse, and inclusive workforce. So next slide. So the way we like to think of it is when you are engaged in some of these analyses, you then get to actually building initiatives and programs as part of inclusion and diversity efforts. And the way we'll talk about this throughout the day or throughout our presentation today is really what we call a risk spectrum. And so what we see is a lot of diversity and inclusion initiatives are made up of a lot of different types of elements that are pretty low risk. They don't run the risk of actually violating the laws that we talked about. They're for the most part not too complicated. But there are other types of initiatives that actually can increase significantly in risk. And so we have set out here some ways in which building goals and benchmarks can sort of creep up the risk spectrum. So one is, certainly you can track your representation data as an organization. Every single day, each organization that we work in has representation data. The people are the people, the data is the data. So a snapshot of representation data and looking at that snapshot of your data over time isn't really that risky, because all it does is simply reflect the current state of the organization on any given day or any given month or any given year. However, going forward beyond that, analyzing that type of data and applying, some type of analysis to it, or a framework for making assumptions, that type of thing can increase, some risk in terms of how you're looking at it, because that can certainly show something more about your data than, just a simple snapshot might do. And then, certainly setting benchmarks or goals, depending on how you do that, creates some risks. So we wanted to dive into the reason why we set this up on a risk spectrum, and the way in which you might be able to minimize some of this risk as you move up the spectrum here. We put quotas or set-asides on the other side of that red line, because essentially, it is typically unlawful for employers in the US to have what we call a quota or a set aside. And if we look at the next slide, we can explain the reason why, but it's a helpful visual, hopefully. So we wanted to differentiate between a couple of key concepts, and then I'll turn it over to Annette to talk about the legal framework for setting goals here just in a minute. But first, we strongly differentiate between the concept of a benchmark or goal as compared to a quota or set aside. A benchmark, of course, being some type of reference, typically outside of your organization, that provides an aspirational comparator, something that is not mandatory. So we're basically comparing to some type of benchmark out there. In the legal industry, a lot of times, law firms or other organizations will benchmark themselves against the Vault survey, the MCCA survey, and other data sources to understand, how are our metrics? Is our representation high, or is our representation low in certain categories? We also look at the concept of a goal being basically a desired outcome, where you have good faith effort to try to achieve it, but that it's aspirational. And very important here, it's not mandatory. It's something that we're trying to achieve, but if it doesn't, get achieved, there's not negative impact necessarily. It's just something to reach for as an organization. These are differentiated from quotas or set-asides, like I said. So quota is typically a required target. It's mandatory and a specific number that has to be met in terms of hiring or promotion goals. So if you're trying to increase, for example, the number of certain underrepresented categories of employees within an organization, having a mandatory number would be similar to a quota, and that's something that the law often does not recognize if that quota is based, of course, on hiring people based on a protected status. So a specific number of women, based on race, based on national origin, color, and the like. Quotas are similar to set-asides. So set-aside essentially refers to a reserved number of jobs or promotions. Again, a mandatory concept where there are a set number of positions that are set aside for certain categories of workers, for example, based on race, disability status, and the like. And so, we will, throughout the discussion today, talk about how you can effectively set goals for an organization, but how you might avoid those goals turning into quotas or set-asides that might be deemed unlawful, under federal or state statutes. So next slide, please. So why don't I turn it over to Annette to give some framework about actual building of goals and some considerations around those.
All right, great. Let's go ahead and dive in and go to the next slide. Laura set us up to talk about sort of the legal framework and really what we're, honing in on as we move forward. We're going to talk about goals in just a moment, but I just wanted to make sure that everybody is aware that what we're talking about in terms of goal setting or, certain workforce objectives that you're moving towards is part of a much larger assessment that we would ordinarily do. So Laura pointed to all kinds of data points, for example, about problems that you might be trying to address. For example, are you having certain attrition problems in a particular group? And so the data and the analysis and assessment really helps drive all of those issues and understand as a starting point through the use of data, where you might be seeing an overall impact. But for purposes of today, we're going to start, focusing in on goals specifically. I will say, though, it's really important to understand there are limitations to data, right? Data only tells you one piece of the puzzle. It doesn't tell you why. It might give you a certain percentage, certain rates that are happening, but it doesn't give you a lot of the information that you need to more holistically understand, the specific issues. But it does help drive and support the program, the DE&I program needs of the organization. So you just start with the data that you have available. You might want to refine that data over time and begin collecting additional data to support your needs, as you grow as an organization, both with regard to the data that you're taking a look at, but also with the robustness of your DE&I strategy. And it's important to make sure that you're fine-tuning your measurements over time. So we kind of put this in a circle because we do believe it's cyclical, right? There are some data components you're not going to have, so you move forward with the metrics that you do have. Hopefully you're starting to capture additional information. You're making changes within your organization, perhaps implementing program strategies to help drive the analysis, but then you're going to continue to fine-tune those measurements over time and just continue to evolve. The other area is to think about is, what is it that you are measuring? Who's going to do the measurement? Who's going to have the access to the data? There are some pieces of information, certainly components of analytics that are highly sensitive and should be shared, at the highest levels of the organization, or using the attorney-client privilege, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Think about very carefully how you're going to distribute the information and how you're going to talk about the information, right? Because there are litigation risks, and how you position, if you have, opportunities within your organization for growth, or what you perceive to be the drivers of your DE&I strategy, or, the reason why you have, for example, if you see a particular opportunity for growth in a particular area, what might be driving it? Do you have qualified women that are in the profession that are out in the labor market, but you're not able to get them to the organization? Or actually, have you gotten them in the organization, but for some reason they're leaving in higher than expected percentages? And so all of those, the reasons behind it, the data only gives you one part of it. So as you think about data considerations, it's important to have that framework in mind. The other thing is that thinking about these goals and strategies holistically is important, so overall as an organization, but also within the organization, are there parts of the organization that are going to have different needs? So for example, if you're talking about a law firm, the needs of the professional staff might be different than the needs of what the attorneys at the law firm are. And so having just one sort of approach to everything doesn't necessarily meet the needs of your organization. Of all of the population within the organization. Or for example, if you might have a large sales group, and the DE&I strategy efforts that you want to implement across the organization, that may not be what drives your sales team, for example. So you really want to use the data in a way that not only looks at the organization holistically, but also looks at the key components within your organization to see if there are differences and therefore different program needs that there might be. So with that, let's just move over into the three-step framework that we're going to be spending a little bit of time on, thinking about how you go ahead and establish goals and benchmarks within the organization. The way we're thinking about it, it is information that's been adopted certainly by the EEOC, and generally speaking, it's a framework that most contractors, employers, consultants, just folks doing DE&I work are thinking about. So these are sort of the three steps, and we'll talk through each one. The first is doing an analysis, right? It's a self-analysis. We recommend doing an analysis under privilege because there are some sensitive areas here that you want to think about and have, robust discussions about from the perspective of how you go about doing the data, what you're actually analyzing, what components of data do you have available to you. And then step two is, okay, what does the analysis tell you? Do you have a reasonable conclusion that you really do need to take some sort of specific action to address a gap or an area of opportunity that the data alone suggests that you have within your organization? And then number three, the data will help you implement the lawful programs that you're going to support. So let's take that first one, that reasonable privileged self-analysis. We can go ahead to the next slide. We're going to dive into that one a little bit more. So the effort here that we're talking about is one basic way. We're talking about goals and for the organization, right? And that has been a significant push, especially this year. There has been lots and lots of questions that we've received from employers across all industries who have had really robust DE&I programs and strategies in place, but they're wanting to really dive in and get a deeper understanding of how they can take maybe a fresh look at their goals, a deeper look at their goals, to understand where they might have underrepresentation within the organization. As I mentioned, we do recommend that this analysis certainly be done under the attorney-client privilege, just so that you can really have those really deep discussions, dive pretty deep into what the data is showing you, come up with some ideas and strategies around it, and then at some point you could obviously roll out your programs that are designed around the self-analysis that you've conducted, but a good starting point would be to keep that information initially under the attorney-client privilege. So where do you start, right? So the first thing you're going to be doing is taking a look at your employee population as compared to what that surrounding labor market suggests you should have. So if in a particular group, well, you can start at an organizational level first. How do I look just, women compared to men, compared to the labor market data? Same with race considerations as well. And then also, certainly that's just a very high level look, but we're also talking about comparing representation in specific jobs or job levels. So are we talking about executives, professionals, entry-level teams? You might look at business breakouts as well. So you might be doing fine in a particular area or across the organization, but when you look at your tech jobs, for example, technology roles, your software engineers, for example, or whatever group you're specifically focused in on, that may show that there's some areas of opportunity there when you look at it different ways. What we're really talking about, and in any sort of robust program, you're looking at all of the ways and levels in which it makes sense within your organization, and there's no single way to do this, right? So every company is structured different. You have different business units that are driving the work. You might be within an industry that you're like, we really need to step up our efforts, on a particular area. We're talking about legal here, right? And for many of those that are on this call. So thinking about, maybe your representation of key committees within your organization, or representation, so, C-suite and board representation, akin for us would be your executive committee or your comp committee or those key decision-making committees. What does that look like within your organization? That's probably going to be a pretty small group, so you can't make, wholesale determinations based on that, but that's important, right? What's your percentage of, how does your partnership rank look like as compared to your associate ranks? And then your professional staff, right? It's also a part of the analysis as well, and it's important to look at it, in multiple ways. You can certainly, we have seen companies that say, hey, everything looks great, but when you look at the organization, you're really seeing a much higher percentage of diversity among the lowest ranks within the organization. And so, progressive companies are really thinking about it and taking hard looks to say, throughout the organization, where should we be looking? And that comparison is really against what the labor market data tells you should be. So there are often certain ideas that are out there about just, coming up with a number. It should at least be 50-50, for example, and that may be appropriate, but it really should be driven off of data, and that data meaning the benchmarks. And with that, we'll go to the next slide to talk a little bit more about the benchmarks, right? That is, who are you comparing yourself against, essentially? There needs to be some sort of way to compare yourself in a way that makes sense within your organization, because remember, we're always thinking about the Title VII frameworks and some of the other laws that Laura kicked us off with, right? So the way to think about this is all of these decisions that you make within your organization, who you have within your organization, somebody made a decision about, somebody made a hiring decision to bring that person or group of people in within your organization. And you have to keep Title VII and non-discrimination provisions always in mind as you move forward on these issues. And at the same time, you're doing a comparison to how do you look compared to your benchmark information. So where does that benchmark information come from, right? It could come from third-party vendors have some of this information. Market survey firms have it. There are certain industries that have a lot of really good market data in terms of availability. That's what we're talking about. Who's available that would have the skills and attributes that you need for your jobs, right? So obviously for attorneys, you want to know how many attorneys do you have. If you're a national firm or a global firm, that's going to be a much broader group than if you're a regional firm. If you're a regional firm and you have certain specialties, you're going to want to know what is my availability within my reasonable recruitment areas, typically how we're looking at it. There's data points like Bureau of Labor Statistics has this kind of information. Census data has this information. EEOC posts on an annual basis information based on certain data collection efforts that they do. So that information is out there. If you're in the educational sector, there's information out there as well. I believe NALP has certain information as well on these issues. So, it's really important to assess where you're at within an organization as compared to the benchmarking information. As I said, there's some jobs that are so unique that it would be impossible for you to set, for example, a 50%, 50-50 threshold for men and women, just because there's no, in terms of availability, you don't have that availability out there. And so there might be different strategies as an industry that you help to achieve. Or to further in terms of pipeline programs and that kind of thing. But when it comes to setting a workforce goal in terms of what you want your workforce to look like, it's really important to assess it next to the benchmark data. Let's go to the next slide. We'll chat a little bit more about this. We do recommend that when you're doing and taking a closer look at benchmarking information, you are looking at position-specific information. You can certainly aggregate if you would like, but when it comes to setting goals, and that when goals typically translates into you're setting some internal data point that people are going to be looking towards, right? So if you set a goal to increase the representation of women by, 10% over the next 5-year period, that says something to the people within the organization and about the programs and the initiatives that you're going to be having, right? So there's always this measurement against that benchmark and that stated goal. So having an unrealistic goal that doesn't take into account the specific positions you have may be, challenging. The relevant labor market is also important. If you, in fact, do not recruit from, U.S. Overall or global even, it's actually, if I'm sitting here in Chicago right now. So if that happens to be my labor market, and that tends to be where I recruit from, then that's the data point you should have. If, however, you're talking about, senior executives, or frankly, you would look anywhere throughout the country, then it shouldn't be the Chicago market, for example. It should be all over. So those are the kinds of considerations that you need to make within the organization. We also have a point here about promotable population. It's not just external, right? It's important to have for your own companies, right, to have promotion opportunities, right? So you're not only just looking to bring people in externally, but you're also looking at internally. What do your pipelines look like? So it's important to have a weighting, and there's a statistical analysis and a lot of, data-heavy work that we do on these issues, but those are also important. Who do you have within your own workforce that could come up in the pipeline, or maybe they're not quite ready yet, but with some training or with some education in a certain way, or with perhaps an additional certification, they could move into that role. So those are the kinds of things that the data might help you when you end up implementing a D&I strategy or a D&I specific initiative to help in that area. We can also talk about, having multiple benchmarks within the organization and how you would group them and weight them together. That's what I mean about having a robust analysis that's done so that you're having these questions, that you can assess. We like using multiple data points if that's possible. So if you're looking at industry data, you also want to, we would certainly recommend having a few other data points. Sometimes the industry data isn't as robust. It's only as good as, survey responses that were made. And so you might not be comparing yourself if you're a smaller organization, for example, and, larger organizations are the only one that responded to the survey data. That might not give you a complete picture of what makes sense for your organization. So we like to mix up the benchmarking information to help you make, the goals that you ultimately set up. It is a way to measure where you stand, against the benchmarking information that's available to you. And then if we go to step 2, once you do that analysis, you're basically taking a look at, we can go to the next slide. You're taking a look at your data points and you are saying, okay, how big of a difference do I have, for example? There are going to be some differences, and in our world, we typically are looking for statistically significant differences. That is not the only benchmark, but if you have a statistically significant difference from where you are within your organization to what the benchmark data says, you should be taking a much closer look at that one than if you have, a much smaller difference. It doesn't mean that there's an actual, discrimination that's been going on within your organization, or that you've had, violations of Title VII going on, or anything like that. But there is some cases, and I'll show that in just a moment, that at least suggest that, all things being equal, over time, your organization should generally reflect what the labor market data says in terms of the breakouts within your organization. So if you have a significant gap then in underrepresentation, then that suggests that there might be certain practices that are, barring a particular group within your organization. And then that's where you start trying to figure out what might be driving that gap or that area of opportunity so that you can start taking a closer look. Let's go to the next slide. And so what might those, reasonable actions be? I mean, we could go on and on. On the next slide, I have a few examples, but, we are constantly fielding questions about how you might go ahead and implement a program that, doesn't run afoul of Title VII and the requirements to not take into account race and gender when you're making hiring decisions, or age is obviously, that's another protected category. Any of the protected categories that we're talking about, how do you go about closing the gap without making specific hiring decisions based on race or gender or any other protected activity? And so it could be, just a really robust list of initiatives that you might implement. Certainly, you want to achieve Title VII stated purpose. That means non-discrimination, and that applies to all races and genders, regardless of the race and gender. You want to, implement programs that are specifically designed to close the area that you're seeing. So, for example, let's just say the data suggests that you have an area of opportunity for women in let's just say partnership ranks. And so maybe then you're taking a look at the analysis and you're trying to understand, well, why is it that I have so many associates who come through and my proportion is just fine when it comes to associates, but yet they don't make it to the partnership ranks? Well, there's all kinds of strategies that you might be implementing around that, trying to understand why are women staying within the organization, or are they just not getting promoted? If they're staying and not getting promoted, that's a different type of potential strategy that you implement around promotional opportunities. If women are leaving the workforce in greater proportions, trying to understand why. We have seen the legal industry change over time to really do things like, create alternative work arrangements designed to assist in these efforts. And they, if done well, then they can really help groups as you think about the strategies that you're implementing within the organization. So really thinking of, do I need to have a certain job or, associates billing at a certain level? Are there opportunities to change how that works? Are there work sharing agreements that you can end up implementing that really can help? Maybe that doesn't apply for all roles and, in all of the groups, but maybe there are some ways to really carry that out. And that's the kind of thinking that the data will sort of get you started on, but then really implementing those programs is really what you're trying to do. And that stops short of making just a promotion decision or a hiring decision on the basis of race and gender. I noted here this unnecessary restrictions on employment or promotional opportunities. One thing that I keep getting lots of questions on, not necessarily in the legal industry, but lots of questions generally is about, the preferred qualifications for certain jobs or minimum educational requirements. We have seen some employers going away from that kind of language that's requiring that. So all these kinds of programs can help you achieve your overall objectives without running afoul of the of Title VII principles. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. We've just identified a few, reasonable and unreasonable actions. Certainly setting the aspirational goals, as Laura mentioned, is something that is appropriate and may be called for as you're taking a look at the analysis and the data and identifying those areas where you have potential opportunities to, look more reflective of your labor pool. Certainly engaging in targeted recruitment. So we do see many employers recruiting from certain colleges that have certain populations. So historically Black colleges and universities. The OFCCP for federal contractors has certain guidance out there, a whole website dedicated to doing that specific type of recruiting and listing certain colleges. So that's also an area that can be helpful as well. Certainly implementing pipeline programs or apprenticeship programs to help overcome a perceived lack of skills, if that's the issue that you're seeing within your organization. All of those are just a few of the many types of actions that we see. Certainly, discharging, employees. So for example, if you have an issue where you have underrepresentation, obviously the strategy isn't to, terminate certain employees, or, if you have a reduction in force kind of situations, selecting them. You also cannot set aside certain positions. So, let's just say you have a summer associate program and you're bringing in a large group. You're not going to set aside, 5 jobs to be filled by people of color or women. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about setting reasonable actions. When you have training programs, to the extent that those training programs are it could be considered a term and condition of employment. So if that training program is really helpful for promotional opportunities, you shouldn't be restricting that to a particular group. And certainly, as I mentioned, termination issues can be problematic as well, depending on how those are implemented. So again, I think the way the data works, and the challenge that we often have is talking about the goals and the strategies and explaining those to people, and then not translating into managers, recruiters thinking that they have to make specific hiring decisions or promotional decisions on the basis of race or gender. So, getting comments like, I need, to hire, 3 more women, this year is something that, is the kind of discussion that could be problematic. So as you think about what the data shows and you think about rolling out goals and objectives within the organization, those are considerations that you want to think about. The way you're talking about goals and opportunities is really important so that your teams don't get the wrong idea about what the fix should be. And with that, I think we will turn it back over to Laura, who's going to talk about more of the risk spectrum on reasonable actions.
Yeah, so appreciate that, Annette. Definitely your deeper dive into how we actually formulate goals, aspirational goals, and then some of the real life tips on things to be careful about. So taking it then back, to a broader spectrum and sort of putting this all back in context, looking back at this risk spectrum concept that we talk about a lot. We do see the building of numeric goals as being something a bit more on the risk spectrum, like a bit higher on the risk spectrum than other things that are lawful but can create some legal risk. And the reason why are a lot of the topics that Annette talked about, a misunderstanding of what a goal is as compared to a quota or as compared to a set aside, the implementation of actions that an organization might take in order to try to achieve a lawful goal is really what needs to be actively managed against. We see a lot of other D&I type initiatives being very common and popular now with the clients that we're working with, and we've identified a few of those here. Again, sort of progressive steps in terms of the legal risk that an employer may need to manage when implementing these. Again, we're not saying any of these are prohibited or just outright per se unlawful. It just means if they're higher on the risk spectrum, you need to manage to the legal risk in a more hands-on way and maybe with a lot more attention as compared to other things. But of course, lots of different, activities can create legal risk if you're not managing them carefully. So we also don't mean to insinuate that focus on inclusive company culture has zero risk either. So hopefully that this concept of a risk spectrum is helpful to you. So we can go to the next slide. And then we had a few questions that we've answered in the question and answer box. Hopefully our answers haven't been too simple, but give a little bit more information about issues we've seen. And then if anyone has any more questions, we're happy to answer some of those if you type them into the Q&A box to the right on your screen. But a couple of other things that we look at in terms of managing goals and benchmarks. And ways in which they fit into our larger, like global I&D strategy. Certainly goals and benchmarks are just one way in which you may use information within your organization to build your I&D strategy. We think that a lot of times there are other ways that you can help to develop aspirational goals, and it may not just be based on your representation data. But it could also be goals that you set within your I&D program more generally about ways in which you may make progress, not just in representation categories, but in employee feedback or engagement. So we encourage organizations to also consider other ways of collecting feedback and looking at data and analytics about your organization, and then setting goals. So, for example, we see some clients doing goal setting around engagement and satisfaction surveys, trying to set a goal of improvement over time about certain metrics that they may be talking to their workforce about. We include the term microfeedback here. That's a concept about soliciting feedback on a more regular basis than just once a year from your employees, and sometimes on just one or two topics. That can be actually a very effective way of getting throughout the year some really helpful feedback about how people are feeling about the organization, whether they feel like they have a sense of belonging, and whether they feel included in terms of measuring their sense of inclusion or understanding as to the way the organization feels about them. We also think it's important to get feedback from employee resource groups, affinity groups, diversity councils. We use the term here employee resource group, but it can be a broad range of different types of groups that focus on inclusion and diversity work. We also have seen a lot of very powerful feedback coming back this year from clients, even within our own organization, from conversations focused on DEI issues or small group feedback that is similar to that. Certainly industry benchmark reports, especially in law, sometimes there are the anonymous survey type reports that come out, and you can learn about your organization and the way in which your own workforce feels about you. Sometimes those can be hard to read, as much as we all work hard to make our organizations a best place to work. We are not always perfect, and certainly in the area of I&D, I think every organization has room to grow and to learn and to be better. So it's really helpful to dig into those and figure out what the good feedback or the helpful feedback might be. And then, of course, there's also third-party feedback. Sometimes, just hearing feedback from different websites or apps, even if it's not a report or a survey of some sort. So we encourage, if you're trying to set and or manage goals and benchmarks, to really be comprehensive about the way you address that, and look at all forms of data, and don't just think about goals and benchmarks as just about representation data and numbers. It's, the DEI journey is really more than just counting numbers on a page, but it's really about making sure that people feel that sense of belonging within their organization. So next slide, please. All right, so we're at the question and answer section. The one thing that we didn't, I think, clarify in that, and we can't, this is a topic that's far too big for the last 4 minutes of today's presentation, but I think we should just comment very briefly that we did not cover specifics related to government contractors who may have a requirement through the OFCCP to have an affirmative action plan. And so that's those are separate plans that an employer may be required to maintain. So we didn't talk specifically about that, but we may want to just comment to those, attending today that if you're a federal contractor, certainly nothing we've said, conflicts with that. You're allowed to have your own, diversity and inclusion programs that go beyond what you might do as part of an affirmative action program, and, building again, a culture of inclusion. And so, nothing like that would be conflicting, but just did want to be clear that we weren't commenting specifically on that topic. Anything you might add there, Annette?
No, I don't think so. I think that covers it, but we should provide the CLE code.
Oh, I totally almost forgot about that. Okay, the CLE code in the last 3 minutes is SS as in Seyfarth Shaw 1142. Again, SS 1142. Thanks for the reminder. Anything else you'd like to touch on, Annette? One thing that a lot of folks on the phone today may want to hear about in the last couple of minutes is about the new executive order that came out. I know the team spent a lot of time, focusing on that this week. Do you want to just, do a quick overview of what that is, and then some just, the top 3 tips of how people may be responding in the DE&I world?
Yeah, sure. This applies to, as of this time, it applies to federal contractors. So if you're a federal contractor, there is a new executive order that came out last week that really touches on training programs in particular that might fall in the realm of in our circles, implicit bias training or unconscious bias training or elements of that. So there are certain prohibited actions as a result of that executive order that are pretty express. You can't take positions against, make statements about the country in general, that the United States is inherently racist, or that any particular group, things like privilege that may have been in, decks or training materials that talk about a particular race or gender having certain privileges is something that would be prohibited for federal contractors. I think it's a very important read if you do work for a federal contractor, are a federal contractor. It also applies to agencies in general. It's going to have, going to take some information that grants also might be implicated. So I think we're going to be getting much more information in the very near term, but it's an important executive order if you are an organization that is conducting training that in any way sort of attributes components of racism, or talks about, it uses examples, for example, a particular race or gender as, sort of needing to, having some sort of responsibility on this idea of belonging. So there's a lot of implications there that you should really take a look at. Happy to, discuss those separately if anyone has specific questions on it. And I know we're at the top of the hour. If you want to, Laura, if you want to close this out.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate those of you who could be here. We got one final question about reverse discrimination being real or not, sort of recognizing that discrimination often is rooted in an issue of privilege and power around, marginalizing certain communities. And while that is definitely true, in talking about reverse discrimination, it is actually very real, because what it is a recognition by it's a recognition that the law actually protects all workers based on race from discrimination. And so while many forms of discrimination are rooted in the idea of privilege, the law, on the technicality, on literally in the words of the law, it would protect anyone based on the categories set forth, for example, in Title VII. So it is something that we have seen, and they are valid legal cases, although they are far less common as a result of, sort of the societal framework we all live in. So hopefully that helps. And thanks everyone for being with us. We appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.